name is David Pye, and in this video I want to tell you the truth about death and reincarnation. I want to tell you about the groundbreaking work of a little-known psychologist called Dr Helen Wambach. Way back in the 1970s, she performed hypnotic regression on groups of people. She took people back to past lives and got them to remember and record their experiences. She then correlated that data against known historical facts with amazing results. She had produced the closest thing to scientific proof of reincarnation. What better place can there be to start a video about death and reincarnation than in a graveyard? Have you ever considered what happens to people when they die? Do they cease to exist completely when the body and brain dies? Or does part of us, such as the soul, remain after death and pass on to higher levels? The angel in this graveyard is gazing up to the sky. Do people's souls go to heaven or perhaps hell when they die? Or are they recycled to come back to earth in new bodies and be reincarnated? Let's just assume for a moment that reincarnation is real. If so, then this life must have a purpose. What is that purpose? Now, if this life has a purpose, you might ask, why would you have chosen this particular life? Many of you might say, I would never have chosen this life. My life is not good, or my life is full of pain and anguish. I hope to explain to you through this video why you would choose this particular life. Dr. Helen Wambach was a clinical psychologist at JFK University, California. As a psychologist, she was used to using hypnotic regression techniques to hypnotize people and take them back in time to early memories of past events in their lives. She was also able to take her subjects back beyond their birth to previous lives where they appeared to occupy a different body in a past time period. Memories of these past lives could be very detailed and in many cases able to be checked out historically. But the problem was that the details of these past lives didn't always tally completely, and there was always some doubt as to whether these past lives were real or some kind of fantasy. So, Dr. Wambach started her research expecting past life regression to be fantasy, and she devised a very thorough program which involved taking groups of people through hypnotic regression to past lives and getting them to record their experiences. That program started in 1973, and 5 years later she published 2 books. Reliving Past Lives, which was the evidence under hypnosis for reincarnation. A second book called Life Before Life was all about people's experiences in the spirit world prior to being born. On publication of these books, she was convinced that reincarnation was real, and she had the evidence to prove it. By the time of her death in 1985, at the age of only 60, she and her co-workers had regressed over 6,000 people. Amazingly, her books are out of print and much of her work has been forgotten. So why was Dr. Wambach skeptical about hypnotic regression? Why did she start her research thinking it might be fantasy? This is best answered by considering what had happened in the news in the years before. In the 1950s, the book by Murray Bernstein on the story of Bridie Murphy was a big hit in the US. It claimed to be genuine evidence of reincarnation. There was considerable amount of verifiable information about the town of Cork and life in Ireland in the early 1800s. Virginia Tighe had never been to Ireland. She was an ordinary US housewife who had been regressed to recall this amazing past life. Such was the success of the book that it spawned not only a film, but 2 songs and even a special dance. Here is a still from the film. This success all led to a determination by the media to dig deep into the case to find flaws in an effort to discredit the claims. Reporters were dispatched to Ireland to dig deep. Faults were found. Bridie pronounced her husband's name as Sian, Well, of course, we know it was Sean. Reporters found the local church named in the book didn't exist. Bridie claimed to be the daughter of a barrister, but it turned out she was the household servant. Certain dates also didn't coincide, even though lots of other details did. The real nail in the coffin, though, was when it was discovered that Virginia's parents were of Irish descent, and when she was 3 years old, there was an Irish immigrant neighbour living over the road, and her name was Bridie Murphy. So the case was under attack, and Virginia was accused of suffering from cryptomnesia. Apparently, she was just remembering conversations with this neighbour and recalling them as her own memories. It was never proven that little 3-year-old Virginia had ever spoken to the neighbour, and even if she had, why would Bridie Murphy from the 20th century be telling her about Bridie Murphy from the 1800s? But the damage was done, and hypnotic regression to past lives was treated with suspicion from then on. So we can see that based on the Bridie Murphy case, Dr Wambach began her research expecting past lives to be fantasy. So let's look at Helen's method. The first thing she approached was, what would she expect if past lives were fantasy? She would expect people to recall famous or interesting lives. If it was fantasy, you wouldn't want to make up a life of somebody toiling away in a field all day, more likely a Napoleon or a Cleopatra. She also expected fantasy lives to be mostly upper class rather than lower class, because they had more money and more opportunity. On a similar basis, males had more money and influence than females in the past, so more male lives would be reported. She would expect time periods familiar to the subject from books, film and TV, such as the Wild West or the Roaring Twenties. Population changes not reflected by the number of past lives reported. From this chart, we can see that world population is static at around 300 million. That was because half the children born during this early time period died in infancy. Many women died in childbirth. There was poor medication, poor sanitation, as well as continuous wars and skirmishes. Adult life expectancy was around 30 for most of the population. This only rose when medicines improved and sanitation improved in Victorian times. So by 1800 the population was over 1 billion, and by the present day we are up to 7 billion and rising. She ran group regressions with up to 30 subjects at a time, no individual regressions. These were an all-day event, subjects bringing along a pillow and a blanket and having lunch and coffee breaks together. Subjects were guided to choose a past life from a selection of time periods. This was done to allow for historical checking. Subjects are asked a series of questions and told they will remember the answers on waking and be able to complete a special answer form, which was handed out at the end of each session. 3 separate regression sessions performed, an identical procedure for every group. Helen didn't want her subjects getting obsessed over a single traumatic past life, so wanted to give them a chance to widen their experience. The results were analysed statistically. Remember, this was in the 1970s, before personal computers, so all this was done by hand. So the aim here is to get as much detail as possible to allow checking against historical facts. So, details about clothes, shoes, social class, etc., including the type of death. Subjects asked to recall their death in their last life without any pain, and crucially, what happens after death. She asked questions about the spirit world and what happened in between lives. Also the birth experience and when the soul connected with the fetus. And finally, an interesting question about those who incarnate with us that we have known from past lives. So having performed all her research and obtained the information from the people that took part in the exercise, how did this data add up against known historical facts? Did Dr. Wambach prove that past life regression was fantasy, or was it proof of reincarnation? So, were there more male lives than females? What did Dr. Wambach find? The results here are from the first book, so based on the first 1200 cases. Clearly, there is no bias towards males. Equal amounts, exactly as would be expected from historical data. Two sets of results displayed, coming out at a 50-50 split. We said earlier that if it was fantasy, then there would be more upper class lives recorded. From the detailed descriptions given, it was easy to decide what class each reported life belonged to. So what did she find? We can clearly see here that the majority of lives, 70% in fact, are all lower class, with 20 to 30% middle class and less than 10% upper class. Again, exactly as would be expected from historical data. The data shows that lower class dominates, including quite simple and generally labour-intensive lifetimes. So what of population changes? Here we can see that Dr. Wambach has added up the number of past lives in each time period and plotted them out. The population curve displayed of all the lives recalled shows excellent correlation with known historical data. We can see the same flat line, followed by the same significant increase as we approach the 1800s. Now, I have only shown 3 graphs here, but there are many more in the books which all show perfect correlation with historical data on items such as clothing, eating utensils, food, travel. The results are all based on the first 1200 cases, but the same correlation was observed over the whole 6,000 cases collected before her death in 1985. It is clear that the lives reported are not fantasy, so we must conclude these are real lives that are being reported. Subjects were asked to recall their death and remember the feelings they had without any associated pain. 85% had a very positive experience, and a typical response was,
"Dying was like being released, like going home again. It was as though a great burden had been lifted when I left my body and floated up towards the light. I felt affection for the body I'd occupied in this lifetime, but it was so good to be free."
Dr. Wambach found time and time again that death is a great release. Those reporting said it was as if they were going home to a very familiar place. So the 15% that didn't have positive experiences experienced violent or sudden death.
"I was hit by a car while I was running across the street. I seemed to continue running across the street and wasn't really aware that I was dead. Then I felt very frustrated and lost because I didn't understand what was happening to me. Finally, I was in a place of darkness, and eventually I saw a bright light. Then I went soaring up through the darkness towards the light."
Here is another subject who died in a war.
"I was fighting, and then my body crumpled. I kept on fighting, but I couldn't seem to affect anything going on around me. I was still on the battlefield, but then I seemed to be joined by others who had died. I couldn't seem to leave that scene."
This particular subject went on to relate the following.
"I soared up high in the sky after I left my body. I didn't want to look back. I seemed to be surrounded by others who were congratulating me on that lifetime. I felt a sense of homecoming and great joy. There was life all around me."
Once again, a very positive experience, a real feeling of returning home. At this point, I will play you a short clip. It's a radio interview, and Helen is talking about the death experience.
I have now taken over 1,400 people through the death experience in past lives. What is reported is that at the moment of death, there seems to be a very calm acceptance of the fact that death is to occur. After death, it seems to be a rather indeterminate time when the spirit leaves the body. An interesting case of this was a young man who was dying of tuberculosis and apparently had a high fever. This was a death in 1922. Incidentally, many of the facts of that past life were proved out on research. But he was delirious, and he said he didn't know quite when he died because he had been in and out of his body for some time prior to the final separation. So, the moment of death is a little difficult to determine, but it seems to be when the person floats up out of their body. Some people describe it as a very sharp, sudden experience, like a pop. Other people describe themselves as floating up. But however they seem to come out of their body, and most people apparently come out of the solar plexus, with a healthy minority coming out of the crown of their heads, they look back on the physical body, and the feeling that they express quite frequently is one of deep relief. It has been expressed to me by subjects as being, thank God I'm going home again. It is a feeling of release, a feeling of no longer being imprisoned in a tiny, limited body, in a tiny, limited world. One very articulate subject, I think, put it best to me. He was in World War I. This is another case where a good deal of the data checked out. He was on the front in France. A shell came. It exploded. He left his body immediately. I said, look down on your body. And he said, I haven't got one. Apparently it was blown to bits. And then he threw back his head and he laughed. And he laughed and he laughed and he laughed. And I was a little concerned about him. This was one of the first regressions I had done. And when he stopped laughing, he said, of course, it's a game. How could I ever have taken it seriously? And I asked him what he meant by this, and he said, well, of course, having a body is just something you do. I'm very glad to be out of that one. He then went on to describe where he was. He said he was floating. He was seeing other people he had known before who had died. And then he said, you know, the feeling is like being a drop of water. And it's so much better to be a drop of water in the ocean than a drop of water in a tiny bucket. And that's what being alive is. Being in a body is. It's being in a little bucket, a little confined space. You can do a lot in that confined space, and it's a great place to learn. I asked if he wanted to have another body, and he said, no, I don't want to be confined again. But then he said, you know, the experience is I can be everywhere at once. I can be anything I like. There are no limits on me. And there was a long pause, and I asked him more. This is one of the few subjects that I really inquired deeply about the after-death experience. And he said, you know, having different bodies is like having the same music come out through different speakers. And each lifetime is a different speaker, which picks up different tones. He said, but the music is the same. I am the same. I just make different speakers for myself. I thought that was a rather beautiful description. Now, I have some statistics here. I'm fond of statistics. They make me feel very centered and proper, and like a psychologist ought to be. So while I have all these people down on the floor going through all their traumas and delights of past lives, I'm sitting there taking little records. And I ask people what they're experiencing after death. And of my group, of this particular group, there were approximately 400 past life trips. And in this group, 60% of them expressed a feeling of calm and a feeling of acceptance, a feeling of freedom and release after death. Another 20% experienced real joy and transcendence. Their experience of death was, it's marvelous. Another 15% were sad or angry or regretful. This is immediately after death. And when I broke that down and looked at the cases where they did express this, most of these deaths were either women in childbirth who apparently feel very badly about leaving helpless children behind, or people who died violently in war and who expressed a lot of feeling wanting to continue whatever it was they were doing while they were killed, and a feeling of having been stopped in the middle of a task, unable to complete whatever they were on earth doing. Only 3% expressed surprise at death, and this is a surprising finding in itself. Only 3% of my subjects felt that the experience after death came as a surprise. It seems as though most people, 80% of the people that I've hypnotized, directly under the level of consciousness, are not at all afraid of death. Indeed, they welcome it. And if this finding holds true for another 1,000 subjects, I think I've really got a hold of something. We are not afraid of death. This is something our society's imposed on us.
While on the subject of death, you may wonder what happens with those who commit suicide. Very few suicides are reported by Dr. Wambach. Of the ones that were reported, the feeling after death was of a realization that they had somehow failed and would have to start all over again. Let's look at the process of choosing to be born and the answers to the probing questions posed by Dr. Wambach. Did anyone help with the choice? Were you reluctant to be born? The purpose of this lifetime.
Yes, I chose to be born. Someone did help me choose, and it seemed to be some voice that I trusted greatly. It was very kind, helpful and wise, very wise. My feelings about the prospect of being born were very positive. When you asked the purpose for this lifetime, it flashed that I was to help broaden people's minds. I did choose to become a male this time. I did choose to be born, I think, but I was with a group of loved ones who supported me and encouraged me to go through this coming lifetime. But I wanted to stay with the loved ones and not be born on earth again. I did know that one of my purposes was to love, but I got no impression for why I had chosen this time period. I felt that I have always been female and that I didn't really choose it. It just seemed the most natural thing. My brother and some soul guardians seemed to be helping me. When you asked about the prospects of being born, I felt, not again. But I also knew I had to learn more. My purpose for this lifetime seemed to be to develop my psychic abilities and correct my diet and health and mental and emotional attitudes. I chose this time period to re-experience life with my present family and friends, who I'd known before and who would be alive in this time. I chose to be a woman to experience motherhood in this life.
So we can see here that there are those who are looking forward to incarnation on this planet, as well as those who are reluctant, but they do agree because they know it's time for them to return and continue their learning. So the birth experience, what was it like being born? Sensing the feelings of the mother, joining with the fetus.
My attachment to the fetus was kind of off and on. It wasn't clear to me when I was actually part of the fetus. I was aware that my mother hoped for a son to replace one she lost. The birth canal experience was very tight but warm, and after birth I felt a kind of sterility and a loudness and a brightness, and I felt that the outer world was so unresponsive. When you asked about the attachment to the fetus, I felt that I didn't really attach until my mother was in labour. The birth canal experience was interesting. I felt a fusion of my energy coalescing, but I felt anger at the loss of control as soon as I was born. I was not ready for the emotions of others I was experiencing once I was born.
Dr. Wambach found that the majority of souls did not join with the fetus until just before birth. In general, most souls found the birth process frustrating over the loss of control and being thrust into a small body. Relationships. Now here we have some probing questions. Do you know anyone in this life from a past life? What was your relationship to them in the past? Is there a purpose to your current relationship?
I knew my mother in a past life when she was my sister. I didn't know my father before or my husband, but I did know my children from past lives. I did know my mother from a past life, but my father seemed very vague. My husband I knew in a past life, but I didn't know my children. One friend came through as someone I'd known well in a past life. My mother had been my sister in a past life where we fought all the time. My father had been my grandfather in another lifetime. My husband was a Sioux Indian when I was a French padre, and I didn't like him then either.
So clearly, this is a lady who has relationship issues to sort out in this lifetime. Perhaps she keeps incarnating and making the same mistakes. Let's hope she learns the lesson and moves on. The pattern is clear though, and it seems that we do incarnate with people we have known from past lifetimes, and those people take on different roles and even change genders. Apparently, there is no gender in the spirit world. That is something that only occurs here on planet Earth. I hope I have given you a flavour here of the 2 books that Dr. Wambach produced. I have tried to pull out the major points from each book. There is, of course, much more information which backs up the findings, but I have had to leave much of it out of this short video. So let's look at a summary of the findings. The research shows that what was being reported did not appear to be fantasy. The research method was repeatable with different hypnotists and different groups. We choose, or we're guided to choose, our present lives. The birth experience is generally traumatic, and the majority of souls enter the fetus just before birth. We incarnate with people we have known from past lives. We have had many past lives, some of which might appear quite dull and laborious, but there are always relationships to work out and goals to be achieved in every lifetime. Now, if there's one thing that I would really want you to take away from watching this video, is that there is nothing to fear about death. We cannot hasten it, but when it comes, death is a great release and a return to our true spirit home of unconditional love. So, in conclusion, there appears to be a mechanism and a grand plan for life on Earth. We are incarnated here to learn, experience, and achieve certain objectives that will add to the greater knowledge of the universe. I sincerely hope you have enjoyed this video. If you would like to know more, please go to my website at reincarnation.me.uk. And thank you very much for watching.